Hey, welcome back to the channel and welcome to episode 2 of Problematic Bible Verses. If you're new here, this is a series where we're taking the most controversial, misunderstood, and difficult passages to understand in the Bible, and instead of avoiding them, we're leaning into them. Because let's be honest, there's a lot of verses in the Bible that people don't just question, they struggle with. And these are the passages that skeptics love to bring up to talk about how immoral, how cruel, and how unjust God is. And if we're being real, a lot of Christians really struggle with how to respond to these claims and these arguments because they've never really been taught how to address them or taught what the scriptures or the verses actually say. So that's what this series is about, facing those questions head on. And also, a quick side note before we jump into today's episode, I heard everybody loud and clear from the last episode. The video quality was horrendous. It was really bad. After I was done, I really hated going back and watching the video, but at the time I didn't have anything better to do. So what I did was I went out, I made an investment in a better camera system, and now moving forward we have an upgrade, and I'm hoping that this makes the experience all that much better for anybody who is viewing it. So thank you for sticking with me as we go through this and build it together. Now with that said, tonight's passage is a very complicated and misunderstood passage in the Bible. It's 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. This is the verse where God commands Saul to kill the Amalekites. And what follows is where the tension starts to hit. Because the command isn't just go and defeat the enemy, it's go and completely destroy the enemy. Men, women, children, infants, cattle, everything. And understandably, this is where a lot of people stand up and say, wait a minute, how can God command people to go and kill children? And so the question of this episode is pretty simple, but also pretty deep. And that is, did God actually command something immoral here, or are we missing something within the picture or the context of what we're reading? Because if we get it wrong, it doesn't just affect this verse, it affects how we view the character of God as a whole. So let's slow it down. We'll look at the historical context. We'll look at what's going on in that verse and in the text around it. We'll look at the language and we'll ask what's actually happening in 1 Samuel 15:3. Now, before we break anything down, we're going to watch a clip that shows how this argument is typically framed by skeptics, because the way it's presented is often much deeper than what people actually realize. It's usually structured in a way that already has the conclusion determined and doesn't leave any room for dialogue whatsoever. So we're going to go through the clip. I'll interject once in a while just to kind of form my opinion, but then at the end of the clip, we'll kind of go explain that a little bit, and we'll go a little bit more in depth into the passage in general and look at some of the information behind it. So here we go.
Yeah, so let me pull up. I think it's 1 Samuel 15:3 is a good example, if I'm not mistaken. 1 Samuel 15:3. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation, men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys. That was God telling people to do that, by the way. I think that it's justice to unalive babies and cattle.
The thing, though, you're trying to move the
yes
goalpost.
Or no? No, yes or no?
No, you're trying to move the
yes or no?
goalpost.
Yes or no? Yes or no?
Wait.
Is it?
This is what's known as a false dilemma. It's when somebody intentionally limits the answers to simply yes or no in order to cut off any real discussion before it even begins. Because the reality is, once you allow for context and discussion, then the point they're trying to make usually can't hold up under any scrutiny. So instead of actually engaging the question, they try to hide behind it. They frame it in a way that prevents dialogue altogether, and in doing that, they actually create the illusion of a strong argument, when in reality, all they're doing is avoiding the deeper issue. That's exactly what this host is doing in this video. He's not actually interested in working through the complexities of the question. What he's trying to do is shut the conversation down entirely. By forcing a narrow and limited answer, he positions himself as holding the moral high ground without ever having to even engage the topic of the conversation himself.
Wait,
Is it?
wait.
Hang on.
Hang on.
Hang on. I'll just mute you, okay? So I can ask my question. You can answer when you're unmuted. So, do you think that it is justice for God to tell a group of people to go into a town and not only unalive all the adults, but to also unalive all of the children, babies, and livestock? Do you think that's justice?
Am I able to speak freely?
As soon as you say yes or no.
Is that how a conversation works?
That's how this one works.
You're trying to box me in.
Just yes or no, man. Just yes or no. And then we can continue the conversation.
So hopefully you can kind of see what's going on in this clip and how the host is trying to control the flow of the conversation and bring the caller to the end result that he's already concluded in his own mind is the right answer. He wants to limit the response to a yes or no because he fully knows that once any kind of questioning or scrutiny gets brought into the conversation, that the foundation of his claim will completely erode and he has nothing to stand on anymore. So instead, he tries to keep the caller at a distance. And while he tries to present himself as being fair and genuine and just wanting to know the answer to a question, it becomes increasingly clear that that's not his motive. His motive is to control the conversation and bring the listener to the end result that he has already determined is the right answer. And I'll be honest, this is pretty much par the course for how the conversation usually goes with most skeptics that I've tried to address over the years. They start off with an oversimplified question. You ask them to expound on it and explain it. And then they intentionally stick with oversimplified answers because they want to avoid any kind of conversation or actual dialogue about their original question because they don't want to actually talk about it or learn about it. They just want to control the conversation. And they've already determined that their viewpoint is the right viewpoint and any other viewpoint that opposes it is incorrect. And so before I ever engage anybody in this topic or really any topic, I've learned to try to ask 4 clarifying questions before the conversation goes any further. If I can show you biblical evidence that supports my claim, if I can show you historical evidence outside of the Bible that does not include the Bible that supports my claim, if I can show you archaeological evidence that supports my claim, and if I can show you scholarly evidence, such as other scholars that hold to my viewpoint and that specialize in this particular subject matter, saying that my viewpoint is a valid viewpoint, will you consider my viewpoint as valid? And if they say yes, then I am okay continuing on in the conversation. But if they say no, then I already know that they've self-determined what the answer is, and they're not interested in actually having a conversation. So the first question we're going to look at, and the first question we have to address, is one that's usually skipped over entirely, and that is, who were the Amalekites? See, most skeptics frame their argument as the Amalekites being this completely random, innocent group all the way over there, just minding their own business, and one day God says, you know what? I'm bored. Let's go kill us some Amalekites. But the issue with that is that this is not the first time the Amalekites are introduced in the Bible. This isn't some random group of innocent people who are just minding their own business. The Amalekites are first introduced in Exodus chapter 17, where they launch an unprovoked attack on Israel, targeting them at their weakest point. In Exodus 17, 8 and 9, we read, "The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men to go out and fight against the Amalekites." So when you go back to the beginning of the story, the claim that skeptics make is actually the complete opposite. Israel is the one standing over here, minding their own business, when the Amalekites decide they're going to go and attack Israel and wipe them out. And later in Deuteronomy 25, we're told a little bit more to the story that sheds a little bit more light on what actually happened. They didn't just attack Israel, they preyed on the stragglers. That means they preyed on the weak, the tired, and the vulnerable. This wasn't just conventional warfare. The Amalekites used dirty and dishonorable war tactics that were meant to be as cruel as possible. Old Testament scholar John H. Walton puts it this way: the Amalekites are portrayed as the archetypical enemy, those who oppose God's purpose and prey on the weak. Their judgment is not arbitrary, but tied to a long history of hostility and violence. And because of that, God gives a declaration. He doesn't give immediate judgment, but he reserves his judgment for a future time. And he declares that Amalek will be held accountable for their actions. In Exodus 17:16, it says, "The Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." As philosopher and theologian Paul Copan explains, the judgment against the Amalekites is not impulsive or reactionary. It reflects a period of divine patience in which a persistently violent culture continued in its ways. Which means that what we're seeing in 1 Samuel 15:3 is not a random act of violence like skeptics try to claim it is. It's the ending of a long-standing, unrepentant, and corrupt nation that has been given every opportunity to renounce their cultural practices and their deification of other gods before Yahweh finally decides, decades later, that they can no longer pollute the surrounding nations and the land with their immorality. Now, here's where we need to be very careful, because this is where people usually start jumping to assumptions. People say things like, okay, but even if they were evil, how does that justify everything in the command? And that's a perfectly legitimate and fair question, but it's also where we need to understand the nature of what's actually being described in the passage. In the ancient Near East, war language was often intentionally absolute. We talked about this pretty extensively in our last video, but phrases like destroy everything, leave nothing alive, or wipe them out completely were commonly used to describe decisive military victory, not necessarily literal exhaustive annihilation. In fact, the term used in verse 3 is the Hebrew word herem, which, again, we covered pretty extensively in our last episode. But just to refresh, herem meant to dedicate something irrevocably to God. So when God told Saul to herem the Amalekites, what he was essentially saying was, I'm claiming this land as my sacred space. So you're to dedicate, force out, and remove, or destroy everything that refuses to submit to my authority or that conflicts with my commands. Old Testament scholar Tremper Longman III explains it like this. Ancient Near Eastern battle accounts regularly used hyperbolic language to describe total victory. Such rhetoric was conventional and not intended to communicate literal, complete destruction. And we don't have to look very far to see this in Scripture itself. We know that Saul is told to dedicate everything to destruction. 1 Samuel 15:3, we read, Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy, or herem, all that belongs to them. And we also know that the Bible seems to record him killing all the Amalekites. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. And yet, we have a big problem, because literally just a few chapters later, we find out that the Amalekites weren't really all destroyed, because they pop up again, not just once, not twice, but they consistently pop up in the narrative of the Old Testament. We see them pop up in 1 Samuel 27:8. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Gershurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. Now this is during David's time. It's after Saul's campaign in 1 Samuel 15. And this shows us that the Amalekites are clearly still present. They pop up again in 1 Samuel 30:1 and 2. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag, the Amalekites had made a raid and taken captive the women and all who were in it. So not only are they still around in 1 Samuel 30, they're also apparently strong enough to conduct military raids. And if we just fast forward a little bit more, verse 17, and David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. And not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. So even after the battle with David, where he strikes down the majority of the Amalekites, 400 of them escape. So this raises a natural question. If they literally were all exterminated in a mass genocide, like the text seems to indicate, then how are they still alive in these future chapters? And they're not just alive, they're thriving enough to conduct military raids and engage in battles. There's also a very small detail that very few people pick up on in the story of 1 Samuel, and I personally don't think I've ever really heard anybody mention it or talk about it, but I think it's pretty fascinating. See, everyone always mentions that the text makes clear that Agag's mother is still alive, as we see in verse 33. Something that, again, should be impossible if all the Amalekites were literally annihilated in a mass genocide. But here's what people generally miss. Samuel assumes this. We get no recording or mention of Samuel being told of anybody being spared in war. It never mentions him walking around the camp to check who survived and who didn't survive, who was captive and who wasn't captive. The text actually records Samuel walking directly into the camp and confronting Saul almost instantaneously, with the assumption that women and children were spared, which is something he definitely shouldn't be assuming, especially as a prophet of God, if complete destruction or herem meant kill everything. See, that's not just a small detail. It's very, very significant. Because if herem literally meant a strict, literal killing of every single person, then that's definitely not something that Samuel, as a prophet of God, should be assuming. The fact that he does assume it suggests that total literal annihilation may not have actually been the understood expectation of that kind of warfare, and that this language was not likely meant to be read in a rigid, wooden, hyper-literal way. And this is echoed again by Paul Copan, who says, Descriptions of all being destroyed often function as stock expressions of victory rather than precise historical recording. But here's the thing, even beyond the language, there's a deeper story that's taking place within the narrative that's trying to be conveyed. This wasn't just about punishment on the Amalekites, it was about containment. See, the Amalekites represented a pattern of habitual violent opposition, not just to Israel, but to anything resembling and dedicated to God's covenantal order. And in the biblical worldview, unchecked corruption never goes, it doesn't stay confined. It spreads like a disease. I actually want to thank Brandon from the atheist channel Mindshift for coming up with an analogy in his video that we're going to watch in a minute. Now, he uses it, as every good skeptic sticking to the script does, to try to make the claim that this was an immoral action by God. But what he actually does by mistake is point out that even if we discredit all the information that we just discussed and we just take the text for what it literally says, that his analogy doesn't actually discredit God's moral justification, it strengthens it.
So here's the funny analogy I thought of. If I had like an ant farm, my creation, I've made their home. I didn't create the ants, but I've put them together. It is for me. Without my witness of it, it might as well not exist in my selfish purview. And I see that one group of ants is utterly evil, or we'll just say there's even better justification. They've gotten a disease. And if they not just get next to, but like breed with this other group of ants, they're going to spread the disease. And so me as creator, as observer, I deem it necessary for these ants to die. Tell me, in what world would it make sense for me to try to reveal myself and my will to the small group of ants who aren't going to understand my ways anyways because they're so much higher, nor can they comprehend my thoughts because they're so much higher. But I'm going to task them on penalty of their own destruction to test, to see if they will obey me. And even though they understood at one point all ants are the same, ants are just ants, they've been convinced by the religion of me as God, as owner, as observer, that these other ants are evil and deserve to be wiped out and that it is up to them, otherwise they are not fulfilling my will to go and kill the ants. Now, would that be insane considering my proportional omniscience and omnipotence compared to the ant, where I could just divide the farm in half? I could separate them. I could drown them in my own little flood. I could spray them with something that kills them instantly, being smited. I don't have to involve the other ants at all, unless I want to. There's no other good rationale for why it would be necessary to command an ant to go kill a baby ant over here when I'm the one that wants the baby dead and I'm the one that can do it with no collateral damage. So if you were a Christian watching thinking this is all silly and stupid and who are you to question God, answer that question. What is the actual benefit in God's desire, in God's plan, or for the human for God to make them? Make them is what it is. It might be a request. You might call it even a command. But if they don't do what God has specifically said, they are disobeying God, they are in sin, they are damned. Would you not agree, Christian?
So here's the three biggest issues with Brandon's analogy. First, he's creating a false analogy. Now, to be fair, I don't think that he's doing this maliciously. I think he's just kind of trying to make his point. But the problem is that his analogy completely removes the human element. And that changes a lot of things. Because ants aren't people. They don't reason, they don't weigh their moral decisions, and they don't operate within an ethical framework. They just rely on pure instinct. So for his analogy to actually work, the ants would need sentience, they'd need moral awareness, they would need responsibility, all of which they simply do not have. So what we're left with is something that feels like a solid comparison, but it's just a foundation that's built on sand. And once you start pressing on it, and introducing any kind of questioning, then that foundation collapses. The second thing is he's misrepresenting the situation to reach his already predetermined conclusion. Notice how he frames the ants as innocent victims who have a disease that they just can't control. That's not accidental, because framing his argument that way allows it to do the heavy lifting for him. The problem is that that is the complete opposite of the picture that we get from reading the scriptures. The Amalekites were not innocent victims of some kind of dilemma outside of their own control. The disease of the Amalekites was sin, and it was willful. Over time, they had every opportunity to turn from their sin, to seek repentance, to submit to God's authority. In essence, they were handed the cure to their disease, and rather than take it, they refused it. Instead, they chose to continue in their own rebellion and even spread the disease. So even within his own analogy, we're not dealing with innocent victims. It's about a willful force that continues to spread destruction and decay. And in that case, removing the source of that destruction and decay wouldn't be seen as cruel. It would be seen as protection. The third issue is that he tries to shift the argument after he's already conceded the main point. He actually acknowledges that God would be justified in judging the ants, but then he chooses to pivot to how God carried that out, as if that just overturns the entire justification itself. But I want you to think about what that means. He's already conceded the why. He's already conceded that judgment was justified. So now the framework of his argument isn't about justice anymore. It's about preference. He's arguing about the method that God used. And if his method objection doesn't hold up, then his entire argument collapses back onto a point that he's already conceded defeat on. And here's where his misrepresentation comes in again. He tries to portray God as forcing Israel into this, as if there are some unwilling pawns in a divine chess game. But that is not at all what the text shows us or what we read about. In Numbers 21, which we covered back in episode 1, we read that Israel expressly asks permission to carry out the judgment. God has already stated multiple times leading up to this that he's capable of handling the situation. He expressly says, I will drive them out on multiple occasions. But instead of trusting God to handle it, Israel decides that they want to be participants and they request to be the agents by which God brings about this divine justice. So this isn't about God coercing people into doing something against their will. It's about people willingly stepping into a role within God's broader plan. And to be honest, at the end of the day, that leaves Brandon in a pretty difficult position, because if God is justified in his judgment and the method objection doesn't hold up anymore, then the argument against God's justice can't stand anymore, because at that point, his objection is no longer about justice. It's simply about disagreeing with how God did things. As John Goldingay notes, divine judgment in the Old Testament is often portrayed as a response to entrenched systematic evil that has become characteristic of a people over time. So what we're seeing in 1 Samuel is not arbitrary, random violence. It's a targeted act of judgment against a people who had for generations, for literal decades, become defined by corruption and immorality. And it's also important to note that Israel isn't acting on their own initiative in 1 Samuel 15. They're not expanding an empire. They're not claiming the land for their own personal use. They were under a direct command, and even in that, they were held 100% accountable throughout the process. They didn't just get a free pass to do whatever they wanted. As Old Testament scholar Christopher J.H. Wright explains, Israel's role was not that of an imperial power pursuing its own agenda, but of an instrument within a specific, limited, and theologically framed context of divine judgment. In fact, the entire point of 1 Samuel 15 isn't even about the Amalekites. The focal point of the entire narrative is Saul's disobedience. He doesn't fully carry out what God commands. He stands in complete defiance and attempts to take honor away from God and place it on himself. And he then, as a last act of disobedience, tries to justify it. And because of that, God rips the entire Israelite kingdom out of his hand, and he ends up losing the kingdom. And that, in and of itself, should tell us something, that this isn't a story that's celebrating violence. It's a story that's emphasizing the importance of obedience, accountability, and the seriousness of representing God's authority. So when someone like the host at the beginning of the video that we watched attempts to reduce this all down to, did God command genocide? Yes or no? Yes or no? What they're really doing is intentionally trying to strip away everything that gives context to the passage. They're trying to mislead the conversation into a false dilemma because they know that their claim can't stand on its own merit. Because once you remove the history, the context, the language, and the theology, it's very easy to paint a distorted picture of what's actually happening. But if you slow down, if you actually examine the text, if you take the time to read it, and you look at it for what the passage actually says, you start to see that this is not a story about some cruel, arbitrary God commanding genocide. It's a story about justice that's been delayed for decades, corruption that's been allowed to run its course, and the moment when accountability for those actions finally comes to fruition. And even then, it's uncomfortable. I'm not denying that at all. Anytime we deal with judgment or death within the Bible, it's usually an uncomfortable topic to have or to discuss. And one could argue that it always should be. But just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean that we should just automatically dismiss it. Nor does it mean that we should just make up complete scenarios just to bolster our own claim and ignore blatant textual and historical evidence to support our own theories. It means that we should rather take the time to properly and fully understand the passage for what it's actually trying to say and the message it's trying to convey. So in closing, if you still want to argue that 1 Samuel 15:3 presents an immoral God issuing an immoral command to kill innocent children, then you have to be willing to overlook three things. Number one, you have to be willing to ignore the biblical evidence. Not just one passage, not just two, but multiple passages within the Bible after this event takes place in which the Amalekites are shown to still be alive. And not just alive, but thriving and active. So if your position is that we have to take the Bible at face value, we can only interpret the Bible from what it actually says within the text itself, we're not allowed to use any interpretive lenses at all, then you also have to be willing to admit that this undercuts your entire argument. Secondly, and this is really important, even if you take the complete opposite approach and you say, we can't trust the Bible at all, what we really need to do is look at the historical and external evidence that we have outside of the Bible. That's how we can get the answers that we need. That doesn't solve the problem either. In fact, it creates an entirely new set of problems because the historical data that we do have, which we covered extensively in episode 1, from every single ancient Near Eastern culture in that time period, in that area, reflects the same exact kind of hyperbolic war language that we're talking about here. So even if you step outside of the Bible, then you still reach a point of tension, not a solution. Third, you have to be willing to ignore the broader consensus of scholarship. Now, just because a view isn't consensus scholarship doesn't automatically make it wrong. Let's make that a point abundantly clear. Are there some scholars who disagree with the consensus? Yes, but they are the exception. They are not the rule. And when your position requires you to not only ignore the biblical evidence, but to ignore the historical evidence, and then on top of those requires you to ignore the vast majority of scholarship work, it's worth asking how strong your position really is. So yes, if you are willing to set all of that aside, then you can still reach the conclusion that this passage depicts an immoral God giving an immoral command to kill innocent children. But once the basis of your argument depends on ignoring the biblical evidence, ignoring the historical evidence, and ignoring the consensus of scholarship study, then you can no longer make the claim that you're just following the evidence, because your search has now become about holding on to a preset narrative that you've already determined. That's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video helpful. I hope you found it enjoyable. More than anything, I hope you appreciated the upgraded video quality. And we should have some more videos coming out shortly. If you did find it helpful, please take a minute to just like, subscribe, and comment. You have no idea how far it goes in just helping drive the algorithm so we can reach more people. And until next time, have a good night.
We got just everything you need. We're here to take the lead. It's not like anything you've seen.